This is an I Am Listening original podcast.
Of every 100 voters in 2019, about 45 were Conservatives. Of those 45, 8 have gone to Reform, 8 are staying at home and not voting, 5 have crossed the floor and switched to Labour, 1 or 2 have gone to the Lib Dems, and 1's gone to the Greens. So they have gone essentially in every direction possible. The Conservatives have repulsed their supporters, their left-of-centre supporters, their right-of-centre supporters. They've managed to repulse half their supporters in all directions.
Welcome to the Kent Politics Podcast, your go-to source for insightful discussions on local and national political matters. Join us as we take a deep dive into local government across the county. Find out what the key decision makers have to say, what your money is being spent on, and how the party's policies could affect how we live. Plus, don't miss our regular feature, Westminster Watch, where we dissect the latest developments and decisions shaping the political landscape in the heart of the UK's capital. Engage with us as we delve into the issues that matter to you and explore the dynamic world of politics from a Kent perspective.
Welcome to the Kent Politics Podcast. In a week, the county went to the polls, there was another twist in plans to convert Chatham Docks, and Dover MP Natalie Elphicke surprised everyone by defecting to Labour. I'm Medway Council local democracy reporter Robert Boddy, and I'm joined by Dan Essen, who covers borough and district councils.
Hello.
And KM Group political editor Paul Francis.
Hello.
We'll be having a chat this week about what's been going on across the county, with a particular focus on last week's local elections, which saw the Lib Dems in control of Tunbridge Wells, Maidstone left with no overall control, and Crime Commissioner Matthew Scott returned for another term in office. We'll also be hearing from regular host Simon Finley and KM senior editor Matt Ramsden, who speak with election expert Martin Baxter from the polling company Electoral Calculus. But first up, Dan, what's been happening with you?
Won't surprise you to hear that I've been pretty consumed by the local election results. Like you said, here in Kent, we had 2 elections last week in all-out elections in Maidstone and Tunbridge Wells. So I spent all of last Friday at the Assembly Hall Theatre in Tunbridge Wells watching the results for that election tumble in.
And who came out on top in Tunbridge Wells?
So the Liberal Democrats came out with an outright majority of 22 seats out of 39. The boundaries and number of seats have been changed a little bit this time round for the election. But they used to have 17 seats out of 48. So whichever way you cut it, they made pretty serious gains. They were already in charge of the council. They used to be the leading members of the so-called Borough Partnership, a 3-way coalition with them in charge, also with the Tunbridge Wells Alliance and the Labour Party, and that coalition's been running the council since the Tories lost overall control in 2021. But other than the Lib Dems, pretty much everybody took losses of varying degrees. The Tories now have only 7 seats and Labour have only 5. And the Tunbridge Wells Alliance, formerly second in command, left with only 4 seats.
And how are they all feeling about this?
Obviously, the Liberal Democrats are absolutely over the moon now that they have a clean majority, and they're probably also happy to no longer require a coalition to be in charge of the council, because them and Labour and the Tunbridge Wells Alliance, for what it's worth, have spent the entire campaign taking chunks out of each other. The Tories were pretty resigned. I don't think any of them expected to make any gains in the elections this time round. None of them told me they did. But Labour, the Alliance and the Tories all agreed on one thing, though, which is that the Lib Dems were treating the election basically as a warm-up for the general election campaign. Mike Martin, former guest on the podcast and Lib Dem parliamentary candidate for Tunbridge Wells, he was pretty prominent in the campaign. He was there at the count. And the National Liberal Democrat Party absolutely threw resources at the seat. So it's no newsflash, but the Liberal Democrats fancy their chances at Tunbridge Wells in Parliament in the general election, and even more so now that they've conquered the council.
Thanks very much, Dan. So, Paul, what's been happening on your patch?
Well, we hear the word seismic applied to lots of political events and stories, and this time there genuinely is good reason to describe it like this. We've had a defection from the Conservative MP Natalie Elph to Labour.
In 2019, the Conservatives stood on a manifesto that was very much centre ground, but under Rishi Sunak, they've abandoned centre ground and broken many election promises. Meanwhile, under Keir Starmer, Labour have changed. And I think that change is going to bring a much better future for our country, and that's why I'm so keen to join the Labour Party and play my part in bringing that important future forward.
Now, nobody saw that coming, and I think there are still some people who might feel a little uneasy about that, and I would include in that Labour supporters. The interesting thing for me is, does this make Labour more approachable to disaffected Conservatives, or does it make Keir Starmer a bit of an opportunist? Now, my view is that I think there was a case for Labour weighing this up and saying, no, we don't want Natalie Elphicke to join our party. She represents the kind of things that we don't approve of. She's been fairly hardline on the small boats issue and on housing and homelessness. But she's there. She's swelled Labour's numbers by 1. Is that going to provide a massive dividend for the party come a general election? I don't actually think it will, personally.
And what are the reasons that she's given for making this defection?
Well, you think of the worst things you can hurl at your Prime Minister, and she's done it, basically. She's accused the administration led by Rishi as chaotic, incompetent, doesn't get things done, and generally thinks he's not the right man for the job. So it's fairly bad news for the Conservatives, but I wouldn't say it's overwhelmingly brilliant news for Labour either. And I think it's interesting to note some of the limited reaction we've had from fellow Conservative MPs. Roger Gale, the Thanet MP, said that she was guilty of a spectacularly disloyal decision, but others have been more muted. Interesting to see that Rosie Duffield tweeted. She's the Canterbury MP who's fallen out big time with Keir Starmer, tweeted that she had finally got a meeting with the leader after a year in which the pair had not spoken, and it had taken the defection of a Conservative MP to get there. So there's a bit of black humour around it all as well, but this is genuinely a case of a fairly seismic political event.
And as you say, Rishi Sunak's firmly in the crosshairs here. I mean, will this mean a leadership challenge for him, or is it a case that, as you say, people see it as so outrageously sort of careerist that maybe they'll unite behind Rishi Sunak?
It won't on its own mean a leadership challenge for Rishi Sunak, but I think there already is a leadership challenge debate going on within the Conservative Party. People being very subtle about it, but not so subtle as you can't see what's going on in the Conservative Party.
So this is quite a big story, so we'll be coming back to this later in the episode. But thanks very much, Paul.
So, Robert, what's been going on in Medway towns of late?
Well, there were no local elections in Medway beyond the Police and Crime Commissioner election and a very, very local referendum in the Arches area of Chatham about a neighbourhood plan, which was approved by 88% of those who could vote on it. But something to update listeners on. Last week, I spoke about the recommendation for approval by planning officers of the controversial Peel Waters Basin 3 redevelopment of Chatham Docks. Now, I said last time that the application will be going to the May 8th planning meeting. However, I think I might have rather jinxed things, as on May 7th, it was revealed that the application would be deferred due to a legal challenge.
Do you have any idea what the nature of the legal challenge is and what it actually means?
Well, following Kelly Tolhurst's Westminster Hall debate last week, she tried to call in the application to the Planning Inspectorate, which the Department for Levelling Up is considering. So everything has to stay on pause until Michael Gove considers all the facts of the application and makes a decision about whether to accept the call in.
Well, it'll be interesting to wait for its day in court then. Thanks very much, Robert.
Right, so now we're going to hear from Simon Finley, who spoke with Electoral Calculus's Martin Baxter on what the latest polls tell us about the presently predicted outcome of the general election, whenever it may happen.
Joining me and editor Matt Ramsden is our special guest, Martin Baxter, CEO and founder of pollster Electoral Calculus, to reflect on last Thursday's election results, what it means for the country and what it means for Kent. Martin, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Simon, good to be here.
Thanks for coming in. Look, many MPs tremble at the very prospect of the latest Electoral Calculus polling, and last week's latest predictions published ahead of the local council and police commissioner elections were pretty grim. 13 out of 18 constituencies in Kent will turn red, and currently all but one are in Tory hands. Can the Tories drop even further?
Well, as a colleague of mine, Richard Rose, said, the only floor in British politics is at zero. If the Conservatives say were to keep changing their leader every month, then they could probably get towards zero. So at the moment, we have them around about 100, and that obviously can vary as public opinion sways to and from the Conservative Party. But in theory, it could go down all the way to zero. We were seeing some very unlikely scenarios, but scenarios in which the Conservatives aren't even the official opposition, that Ed Davey and the Liberal Democrats could be the official opposition with more seats than the Conservatives. So as I say at the moment, that is not looking a likely possibility, but the Conservatives can do worse than they are doing at the moment.
Was there any reason why you decided to do the latest polling results before the election as opposed to after the local elections?
Oh, I'm afraid that's just routine. We have new predictions come out on the Electoral Calculus website every month. And so we came out on the 1st of the month, and it was just coincidence the local elections were shortly afterwards. We will have new predictions at the end of this month.
Okay, Martin, that's fascinating stuff, hearing how bad things are for the Tories. So would you have a view on what a safe majority might be for a Conservative MP? We hear all sorts of things now about someone with a majority of 20,000 might be looking at being defeated. Is that realistic?
I think there's almost nothing like a safe Conservative seat at the moment. I'm just having a look, say in Kent, so in the Faversham seat, we think the Conservatives, Helen Whately, will hold that one, and then...
But it's a much reduced majority, according to your calculations.
And she's got a majority of 20,000. And then we're saying that one becomes a pretty ultra-thin marginal, yeah. So 20,000 votes can disappear under our calculations.
But the website also says that Sevenoaks could go to Labour, but no one really thinks that that's true. I mean, after all, say the Lib Dems really fancy Tunbridge Wells, yet you say it's a narrow Conservative hold with Labour in second.
I think at the moment we've got it as narrow Labour win with Conservatives second, but yes, it's very close. Again, this is based on our modelling, which we run this method called MRP polling, which works by taking a very large poll of about 10,000 or 15,000 people. And we ask them how they're planning on voting, but we also ask them other characteristics about themselves, how they voted in the past, and their age and education level and so on, and also look at various attributes of the bit of the country they live in. And then we've got an algorithm, slightly fancy algorithm, that looks at the relationships between voting intention and those other properties. And then we use those relationships to various places in the country, i.e. seats, where we know how many people there are of particular age, how many people of particular education, what the local characteristics of that seat are, and we put that all together to get a prediction. So the prediction is very much based on the science, the best science that we can. It's the same method that we used at the last general election, and other pollsters have used it as well to get good results. So we think it's the most accurate thing we can do. And at the moment, with the very strange changes in public opinion, yes, we are seeing that seats like Sevenoaks, which used to be very, very safe Conservative, are in play. But one of the things our polling tells us, even without the fancy modelling, just straightforward asking people how they're going to vote, is that the numbers of people leaving the Conservative or stopping supporting the Conservative Party is even larger in safe Conservative seats. Safe Conservative seats see the greatest numbers of people defecting from the Conservatives. And in many cases, they are going off the Reform Party, or they are staying at home and not voting. It's only smaller numbers are actually voting for Labour or the Liberal Democrats or the Greens. So disenchantment with the current Conservative Party is running very strongly at the moment in the country, and it is running particularly highly in formerly safe Conservative seats.
When you do your polling and you're asking your sample what their opinions are and how they intend to vote, etc., and where they stand on certain issues, do you take local issues such as hospital closure or a bypass or something like that? Do you take that into account?
Well, a little bit where we can. So we do put in local area properties like ones which can be made numeric. So the past performance of parties at various general elections, what's happening in the local council in the sense that how many councillors there are for each party. And we also look at neighbourhood characteristics like average income level, indexes of multiple deprivation and so on. So we put in local data where we can, but it's we can't really cope with local stories like, is the hospital in danger of being closed, or other issues about what's going on politically in the neighborhood. So no, we can't cope with that. So the models are never perfect. We never get everything absolutely right, but we try and do the best we can.
Yeah. So how accurate is Electoral Calculus, say, compared to other polling organisations such as YouGov or Survation or whoever?
Well, I think it really depends on what methods you use. So we use this MRP method, and we've got a lot of evidence, and there's a track record showing that tends to be a bit more accurate than using the the more classic old-fashioned polling methods. So at the last election, we used MRP methods, and we made the most accurate pre-poll prediction. YouGov were also using MRP, and they also made a pretty good prediction. It wasn't quite as close as ours, but it wasn't bad.
How far were you out from 2019?
I think, well, we certainly predicted a chunky Conservative majority. I think we said the majority was going to be about 50, and it was 80, so we didn't get it exactly right. But we were within 20 seats or so of predicting the Conservative total. And remember, this was a time when there was a lot of uncertainty whether the Conservatives would even win.
Did you predict the Red Wall seats correctly? That's where it was won effectively, wasn't it?
It was won essentially, well, there were three things that won the Conservatives the election. The fact that Boris Johnson was charismatic, that Jeremy Corbyn was distrusted by a lot of the British people, and getting Brexit done. So we certainly captured the fact that there was a big swing to the Conservatives with people who had voted for Brexit and voted to leave in the EU referendum, whether they had voted Conservative before or not. And equally, there were swings away from the Conservatives with people who voted Remain, even if they had previously voted Conservative. So we captured, and MRP is very good at capturing that sort of dynamic, where on the surface, maybe the percentages aren't shifting too much, but beneath the surface, there's lots of swings of voters in various directions. And that's what we're seeing this time as well. It's not just about the totals, it's about where people are going. So Conservatives are going to reform or staying at home. It's quite important. A lot of Conservative voters are staying at home in a sort of mirror image to what happened in 2019, when a lot of traditional Labour Party supporters stayed at home rather than voting for Jeremy Corbyn, of whom they had suspicions. Those people on the left are now going back to the Labour Party because Keir Starmer is less frightening to them. But on the right, the Conservatives have pushed many of their supporters away to not voting. Disadvantaged.
Okay, well, give or take, Labour is around 20 points ahead in the polls, and generally that's reflected in your results. It's 43% roughly to Labour and 22% to the Tories. But Theresa May was 20 points ahead when she called the 2017 election. So, I mean, could this happen again?
I mean, the public can vote however they want. And we did see in the 2017 election that, yes, the Conservatives started with a big lead. And we actually retrospectively did some MRP analysis on that. And we saw that every week as the campaign went on, the Conservative lead shrunk and shrunk. I'm afraid the more Theresa May campaigned, the less popular the Conservatives became. It's startlingly clear in the figures. Yeah. Now, it is possible that Keir Starmer might have a similar effect on the British public. We don't know. My suspicions at the moment is that the public's hostility to the Conservatives is quite deep-seated and might be harder to shift. But on the other hand, there is, a lot of analysis and commentary that support for Labour is, although it's very broad, it's perhaps grudging and not so deep. So it could slip away a little bit, or could slip away to some extent. I'm not sure where people would go, whether they would go to the Liberal Democrats or the Greens. Yes, nothing is certain. The people get the final decision in the end. There was a bit of analysis conducted by Sky after last week's election results were coming in on Friday, and they crunched the numbers through a certain algorithm, and it said that the Labour Party would probably be the biggest party, but wouldn't be in overall control. Effectively, there would be a hung parliament. Do you buy that? It doesn't match the national poll figures we see. That the trouble with the local elections is that there's lots of votes for smaller parties and independent candidates. That won't happen at a general election, and these votes might have gone to Labour in a general election. And so the local elections tend to understate the Labour votes and make it appear smaller than it is. And I think obviously that local elections didn't include any data from Scotland because there were no Scottish local elections this year. But we think there are quite a lot of changes happening in Scotland. The SNP are less popular than they used to be. Labour are more popular. And it could be that Labour win over half or around half the seats in Scotland. So the local elections on their own, although they're a very interesting data point, are not conclusive, I'd say.
In recent months, the Conservatives have tried all sorts of different things to move the dial. We've had tax cuts, we've had talk of increased defence spending, we've got Rwanda ongoing. but nothing seems to work. From your research, what are the things that they could do to shift the dial, or is it just a done deal? It's not going to happen?
Well, yes, that sort of political strategy is harder to put numbers on. In terms of, we did a poll earlier in the year where we asked people what their big issues were to them. Many of the people leaving the Conservatives to go to Reform or staying at home were worried about crime and immigration. So doing things on those might help. You could be right with the sort of implicit thesis of your question, which is it's too late now for the Conservatives. No matter what they do, is not going to make much difference. That they do seem to be experimentally trying this out, and that does seem to be what's happening at the moment. That they, as you say, they have tried a number of things, and that poll lead of 20% has been pretty steady for many months now. The Conservatives, going back further under Theresa May, were behind in the polls. Mm-hmm. As soon as Boris Johnson became leader, they went up ahead in the polls. When Boris Johnson stopped being leader, they crashed down in the polls. And so the main factor that moves Conservative vote share is whether Boris Johnson is the leader or not.
Yeah. Okay.
And at the moment, they're not changing the answer to that question.
Yeah.
And so they're not changing in the polls.
Yeah. Just finally, as we wrap it up, you recently described the Conservatives in polling terms as mass spectrum repulsive. Apart from sounding like a particularly nasty condition, what does that mean in polling terms?
What that means in polling terms is that people who voted Conservative in 2019 are deserting the Conservative Party in every possible direction. So of every 100 voters in 2019, about 45 were Conservatives. Of those 45, 8 have gone to Reform, 8 are staying at home and not voting, 5 have crossed the floor and switched to Labour, 1 or 2 have gone to the Lib Dems, and 1's gone to the Greens. So they have gone essentially in every direction possible. The Conservatives have repulsed their supporters, their left of centre supporters, their right of centre supporters. They've managed to repulse half their supporters in all directions.
That sounds like quite a feat. Martin, I just want to check in with our political editor, Paul Francis, who I know is listening into this, and I just want to know if he wanted to say anything or ask anything.
There was one issue I did want to ask a question about, and that is whether there is a differential vote in some of these coastal constituencies where there are kind of particular issues around poverty and social demographics.
There might well be. It's a very good point. We do include house price indicators and local income statistics and indexes of multiple deprivation. So where there are correlations between how people tell us they're going to vote and those things, we will pick that up and then apply it. So, for instance, suppose we discover that people in areas with high multiple deprivation and low house prices are more likely to vote Labour. If you've got a ward in Kent with those characteristics, we will predict a bigger Labour vote in that ward.
Right.
So we try our best to capture those effects.
Are they differentials which are significant or just around the margins?
The algorithm is trained or is instructed only to look at variates that have a statistically significant contribution. If something isn't statistically significant, then we don't use it. So I don't know if you saw that Labour came up with a list of their non-battleground seats.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
I saw it.
Yeah, which was very much a nudge, I think, to sort of, to supporters there saying you can vote for the Lib Dems, we don't mind on those seats. What we discovered the last time we surveyed is the public have resolutely ignored that advice and are completely indifferent to Labour's non-battleground list. And although we put it in as a variate for the algorithm to look at, and we thought the algorithm would pick it up, the algorithm said, nope, there's no correlation between the Labour non-battleground list and voting intention at the moment. That may change, of course, as it gets more widely discussed.
Yeah.
So that we keep watching it. And then we have a look, where are the parameters we got last time? Okay. Local income was a statistically significant variate. Local deprivation was statistically significant. Places which are underdeprived vote Lib Dem. Places that are more deprived vote Labour.
Okay. I think this is just a personal view, Martin, more than anything else. When do you think the election will be? And if you were a betting man, how will it turn out?
Okay, well, I don't want to bet on the timing because that's hard. Yeah. I think Rishi Sunak is hoping things will get better, and he's not having an election until they get better. They, of course, may not get better. A pollster friend of mine, another pollster, thought that he might wait till November because then he'd have done 2 years, and that's a psychologically pleasing number for Rishi Sunak. But my own guess is September.
Oh, really?
Just so there's some elements of surprise. If he keeps waiting and waiting and waiting, everybody knows when it's going to be, and he loses the initiative. Who knows? I think your guess is as good as mine on that.
Okay.
But you asked for a bet on the result, Labour victory.
Yeah.
So,
By how many, though? What sort of majority?
It's in majority more than 100.
Okay.
Listen, Martin, thank you very much indeed for your time today, and I appreciate taking time out to speak to us. It's been very interesting.
Well, it's a great pleasure.
Is there a topic that you would like to be discussed on the Kent Politics podcast? Perhaps you've got a question for one of our panel, or you'd like to comment on a hot topic in local or national government. Get in touch by emailing or sending a voice note to kentpoliticspodcast@thekmgroup.co.uk.
Well, thanks to Simon there and Martin Baxter, who made some really interesting points. Paul, what did you take from that interview, and what happened there with the local elections in Kent last week, and what's going on with Natalie Elphicke?
I think in terms of the electoral calculus verdict or prediction, nothing massively surprising there. If you look at the Dover seats prior to the defection of Natalie Elphick, they were rating Labour's chances of winning that as above 90%. So, you could excuse their candidate from perhaps sitting back on his armchair and relaxing for a little while. Mm-hmm. I don't see any particular surprises there. I don't think there's going to be a massive wholesale wipeout of Conservative MPs necessarily. I say that with some qualifications. Even back in 1997, when Tony Blair was leading the Labour Party, his poll ratings were on average around about 13% ahead before the general election, and that's exceeded by Keir Starmer's current ratings, Labour's ratings at 20% if you average out all the polls. So there's a bit of a gap there, and I think if you're asking about elections, people might start questioning why they're not getting a by-election in Dover, because the defection of Natalie Elphick inevitably triggers that question, because people always say, well, she was voted in as a Conservative MP, I didn't vote for a Labour MP, so why doesn't she do the honourable thing? Now, there's a bit of history in Kent about defections, and the last person who did do the honourable thing was a guy called Mark Reckless, who was the Rochester and Strood MP under UKIP flag for a little while, won the seat in a by-election before the big general election of 2015. And people might say, why don't we get Natalie Elphick to do that?
Yeah. I mean, Dan, you have some thoughts on sort of the reasons behind this move and what it actually means.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, she isn't re-standing, at least not for Dover. So, the clear political gain from it for her is pretty questionable. But on a broader point, so we had her on the podcast in January, and back then, we had she wasn't full-throated in her support of the government, but we had no indication of her, of any sort of criticism of them. Those of us who cover politics and news in Dover quite regularly receive weekly columns from her into our inboxes proclaiming her support for this, that and other government policy. No one's ever really had much reason to believe she's particularly, at least not openly critical of the Conservative Party as a whole, rather than small policies here or there. And, all of a sudden, out of completely nowhere, she defects to being a Labour MP. So up until a couple of weeks ago, she was very loyal Conservative, and now she'll have a Labour membership card which says, Labour is a democratic socialist party which believes, and so on and so on. And are we to believe she suddenly had some kind of Damascene conversion to being a person of the centre left, a social democrat or a socialist or the like? Pretty questionable. I think it's not a very good sign that politicians obviously view their parties to be more or less interchangeable between each other, and they obviously, if members of Parliament don't think that their two parties represent particularly competing visions of what the country should be like, what are the public meant to take from that?
I mean, Paul, do we think that it's a case of principles? The Conservative Party doesn't represent her, so she's going to go with Labour. She really believes in the Labour project, or, this is nothing new, is it? People defecting from other parties.
Defections aren't new. In her particular case, I have to be a little bit sceptical about her reasons for deciding to quit the Conservative Party. As Dan said, it's not absolutely clear why she's made that decision, other than the inevitable conclusion that you come to, which is that she doesn't like Rishi Sunak, thinks he's a bad leader, and thinks this will hasten his demise or contribute to the hastening of his demise as leader. It seems a bit strange to me, the timing, the way she's couched her decision, language she's used. I'm not saying she doesn't necessarily believe all these things, but given the time frame we were operating in, it seems a bit of a surprise.
You spoke earlier about the idea of who does this damage more? Does it damage Rishi Sunak more in the sense of prospective Conservative voters will look and say, well, this Conservative MP's moved to Labour, maybe I'll give Labour a shot, versus Labour supporters saying this Conservative MP has joined Labour. Is there really any difference between the two parties? People who maybe have a more left-wing persuasion. Who do you think comes off better off in this?
I suppose the answer would be no, none of the above. In some ways, it's a question of who is worse off in the round as a result of this. And my view is that Natalie Elphicke comes out of this not terribly well. As I said earlier, my strong view would have been that if I'd been one of Keir Starmer's aides, I might have said, think carefully about this one, because it might play better if you decide to turn her away.
And so what do you think is it in it for her? I mean, people online are suggesting maybe it's sort of a peerage. She might get moved to a different seat and represent Labour there. I mean, do you think that's likely, or is it just entirely a vendetta against Rishi Sunak?
Well, I think political preferment, if it comes, is some way away because they wouldn't want to do anything like that in the run-up to the general election. And in any case, we're not quite sure whether she's going to stand or find a berth somewhere else. It's often the case that with defections comes an agreement that the defecting MP will they'll find somewhere for them to stand. I don't think that's necessarily going to be the case here.
So Dan, what's your take on this? What does Natalie Elphick get out of all this?
Like I said, I really don't know at all. And, I'm from Dover, and loads of friends and family in Dover have been texting me over since this happened, saying what's going on. I have to say basically the same thing to them. But if I had to guess on what she gains from it, I think Paul's probably right that it's doesn't look particularly good for Rishi Sunak. I don't think anyone thinks it looks good for her either. But also, if I had to guess, she's quite accomplished in the field of housing. The Labour Party under Keir Starmer is trying to make housing a big policy issue. Starmer also has a bit of a penchant for quangos and NGOs and quangocracy, so maybe she'll get a position in some kind of independent state agency as a result for this. But literally, who knows? Maybe she'll disappear, and this will be the last we ever hear of her.
It's another sort of instance of bad news for Rishi Sunak, isn't it? I mean, another defection. The other week we had Dr. Dan Poulter, who again was a Tory MP who left the Labour Party. And then on top of this, we've also had the sort of disastrous local elections nationally, with the Conservatives losing 474 councillors, losing control of 10 councils, losing the West Midlands Mayor Andy Street, and Ben Houchen, the Tees Valley Mayor, also having a significantly reduced vote share. I mean, talk to us a bit about what the local elections mean for Rishi Sunak.
Well, I think they just add to the pressure on him as leader and highlight the difficulty he's got in trying to reverse the party's fortunes. He stood on a particular platform of policies, the usual Conservative stuff about Conservative councils cost you less, but he needs a different vision. I think people will be a bit disenchanted with his previous policy template that he was drawing up for the party, and I think he needs to go in some kind of different direction. But the problem he's got is time, and he hasn't got the time necessarily to implement a radical reform of the party. And if he does, he's bound to come up against people who are opposed to it, and some of those people might well be in the Conservative Party. So he's not got a lot on his side. He must be thinking, what's he done to jinx his leadership? So I think the difficulty for him is that time is running out.
Dan, I mean, what's your take on sort of the effect of the local elections? I mean, how are people feeling on the ground about Rishi Sunak? Is there sort of a groundswell of maybe it's time for a change of leader?
I don't know if there's a sort of organic movement of Conservative members who necessarily want the leadership challenge. I think anyone except the most excitable of Tory MPs would realise that would look absolutely terrible. But their foot soldiers in the form of Conservative local councillors are not very happy. I was at the count for the Tunbridge Wells election last week, and every Tory I spoke to there was pretty resigned about it. All of them, when I asked them about how it was going, they said, well, it's not been a good day for the Conservatives. They all thought it was the local election results, despite the low turnout and problems generalising the results, all Tories I spoke to told me that they thought poor performance in the local elections as a result of how dissatisfied people are with the Conservative Party as a national government. Greg Clark, Tory MP for Tunbridge Wells, and nowhere to be seen at the count, not even to give out any commiserations. So I don't think there's an appetite among Conservative politicians or members for regicide at the moment, though the Tories are pretty keen on that usually, because I think it's just happened too many times in the last Parliament that they think it would look terrible. But I think in general the mood I detect from Conservative members and politicians is one of resignation. I think some of them may just be asking for a general election to put them out of their misery.
And as we heard in sort of Simon's discussion with Martin Baxter from Electoral Calculus, he was saying that he's expecting an election around September, and if an election was held today, you'd see the Conservatives on sort of around 80 seats, which is really sort of a punishing result. I mean, what are both of your predictions for sort of when the election might be and what would happen?
Well, I've predicted November. Sometime early November, partly because it can come after the conference season and possibly a mini budget of some description, which should try and be the launch pad for the Conservatives' election campaign. So I would go for that. I think if the election's held in December, people are going to be a bit turned off by it all, because it'd be in the run-up to Christmas and people have got other priorities on their mind. There are some people who still think a late summer election is possible, but I'm not amongst them.
Yeah, I think the election definitely won't be in the legal latest date it can be in the end of January, because the campaign would have to go over Christmas and the government would have to be truly suicidal to expect anyone to care for a political campaign over Christmas. So yeah, I think Paul's probably right. October, November, to give them time for some more fiscal events and economic policies, hoping that they'll actually affect the public before the election.
Just to close, I mean, back in 2019 at the last general election, I was looking up and the Tories won an 80-seat majority, and now with all these defections, these suspensions and all the rest of it, their majority is down to 45, which some people are suggesting is basically a very, very slow general election as we have a gradual turnover of every single MP. But thank you both for your really interesting insights there.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for joining me on this week's podcast. We'll be back next week when we'll be having a chat with the former Deputy Prime Minister and long-standing Ashford MP, Damien Green, who'll be lifting the lid on the latest going on in Westminster. You can follow us on X, formerly Twitter. Just search for the Kent Politics Podcast. Also, don't forget to tune in to KMTV at 5 p.m. each Friday for their politics show. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Kent Politics Podcast. Don't forget to check out stories throughout the week on the politics page of Kent Online. And you can watch the Kent Politics Show with Rob Bailey on KMTV every Friday at 5 p.m. or on demand at kmtv.co.uk.
This has been an I Am Listening original podcast. For more information, head over to our website, im-listening.co.uk.